Greening the EU. An overview of the Green European Foundation's Belfast Summer School 2014. From the 6th to the 8th of June 2014, the Green Foundation Ireland hosted a summer school on the topic of greening the EU in the context of the Eurosceptic debate. Speakers from Ireland, North and South, were joined by others from a range of European countries to discuss topics such as the return of nationalism in this centenary of the First World War, the UK's position in Europe, especially given the forthcoming referendum on Scottish independence, the future of European energy policy, fracking versus renewables, and the case of Belfast as an example of conflict resolution in a contemporary European context.
Extended recordings of most of the sessions will be made available through the website of the Green Foundation Ireland, but in this short programme we've put together a few selected highlights to give something of an overview of the range of issues discussed.
Given the upsurge in popularity of parties like UKIP in Britain and the Front National in France, it's instructive to look back 100 years to what historian and playwright Philip Orr calls the tussle for national identities in Europe, around the time of the outbreak of the First World War. It's not the only thing from that era that has a contemporary ring, as Orr points out.
Rising against British rule and all-out separatism. By the time the war is over, Sinn Féin, the small party, small initially, that supports that separatism and supports that rising, is beginning to surge up the polls and comes out very well in the election of 1918. In the 3 or 4 years that follow, there's chaos in this city, there's blood in the streets, there's an Irish Republican Army formed, there's a war of independence, the British try to suppress it. The outcome of the chaos, in many ways, is the partition of Ireland, a border, a 6-county northeast, still firmly under British rule, though with its own parliament, and then the Irish Free State that eventually mutates into the Irish Republic. What I'd want to say is, we have to see, I think, the creation of that border in the context of everything about Versailles and what happens out of the First World War. Borders going up everywhere. The old empires dissolving. They're already on the way to dissolution. The fact that they're on the way to dissolution in the case of Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire is part of why the tinderbox of the Balkans occurs and the war starts to catch flame. So, what we're talking about then in 1918, 1921, 22 is the creation of a border and highly disgruntled minorities on either side of it. Does that sound familiar in Europe? Things simmer for many decades, but then in the 60s, in that era of post-colonial discourse and civil rights around the world, there's a means to start to look for change, and you have a civil rights movement blockaded by unionism very severely, and that explodes into the conflict that we know about as the Troubles, rather euphemistically, from 1969 through until the 1990s.
With rather pleasing symmetry, the conference was to return to the issue of the resolution of the Troubles in the final session, but there was plenty of ground to cover in between. First, Philip Orr again on an intriguing direct effect of the war on Northern Ireland. Then Erica Mayos of the Dutch Green Foundation argues for a kind of commemoration of wars that would unite rather than divide.
Ray Davy, fascinating old man, died recently in his late 80s, I think. And I met him and I read his prison diaries. Ray Davy was a Presbyterian minister, became a chaplain, ended up prisoner of war in Germany and was near Dresden when Dresden was bombed. He was devastated by witnessing this, because what it brought out, of course, is the moral complexity, and not the moral contradiction, of being there, knowing that Germany, in a sense, had to be beaten, the Jews, all the terrible things that had happened, the need to get rid of that Nazi regime, and yet witnessing carpet bombing taking place in order to create that. And then, to make it even more complicated and difficult, he got to know some German families in a little village called Hohenstein. When he left, he wanted to get in touch with them again, and the Iron Curtain came down. and he couldn't meet them again, which haunted him. Yeah, European history here in Belfast. But out of that, intriguingly, he eventually got back to East Germany, but he never found in the 1970s or 80s, he never found that family again. But out of that experience, that European experience, he founded a community in the it's 50 years ago, so what's that, mid-1960s? Called the Corrymeela community on the north coast, which is, I think it's fair to say, probably the single most significant community a community organisation in terms of dealing with with a broadly Christian ethos, but only in the most broad and non-sectional way, right? Dealing with the whole issue of our troubles as they started to emerge in '69. So it's a place where many people have gone down through the years, perpetrators, victims, those who feel they're neither, those who are affected by the whole thing. And so in some interesting way out of that, Dresden experience, which doesn't, of course, I hope, sentimentalise that awful experience, but out of it, nonetheless, that was the seed of some kind of possibility.
The proposition I will try to defend tonight is the following.
Erica Myers.
If we want to maintain a sustainable European democracy and a pluralistic and peaceful European community, we should commemorate our old wars not only at a national and local level, but especially at a European level. And in short, these are my arguments. I already give them before I really start explaining why. If you commemorate only at a national level, which is often the case, you reproduce a nationalistic and often even militaristic rhetoric, which is, I think, not helpful for the reinforcement of European collaboration, which we obviously need to solve a lot of international problems. The risk even exists that you commemorate and honor the same nationalistic rhetorics that led Europe into war before. If you commemorate at a European level, national stories will meet each other. This can be confronting and painful. It is a difficult, but I think very necessary exercise in listening to each other, and in doing so, in building trust between peoples and cultures. Without this trust, even the economic and financial collaboration in Europe will collapse in the long run. If you commemorate at a European level, you escape the nationalistic frame, and by doing so, you are creating the space to commemorate those who fought in wars and despised the war. The anti-fascists, the deserters, the ones who lost all their faith in a military way of solving conflicts, and those for whom nationalism was bankrupt. And those are usually absent in these official national commemorations.
For Myers, part of the solution is to attend to these marginalised voices, and part of the solution is to do so at an explicitly European rather than national level. The war destroyed, or ought to have destroyed, all notions of the inexorable progress of humanity, particularly as led by Europeans. And yet it was out of that shattering experience that the idea of European solidarity eventually emerged. The dead can no longer speak, says Myers. The living will have to declare what moves them and what they cherish, and what they have lost and what they hope to become one day. The next session of the conference presented an opportunity to begin to articulate some of those hopes, but also to explore certain fears as manifest in the rise in support for nationalist parties on the far right. Maria Wetterstrand of Cogito, Sweden, brings a Scandinavian perspective to bear and reminds us of opposition to the EU, not just from the right, but also from the left.
But the other thing was that we got a new political party in this. They are not new, but it was the first time they entered the European Parliament, and it's a feminist initiative. Mm-hmm. So they became very much the center of attention in this debate in Sweden. And they certainly took some of our votes. Of course, they were not ours since we didn't get them, but they could have been ours if it had not been for them. So we could have made maybe even a better result without them. But they will also get 1 seat in the European Parliament, and I hope the Green Group will manage to get them to join, because I think they will feel more comfortable with the Greens than with the left socialists. The discussion was about the environment and equality and feminism. So those old political parties didn't have very much to say, actually. But we also have in Sweden the Sweden Democrats, who got 9.7%, and they are this nationalist ex-Nazi party, which oppose immigration and hate foreigners. It's always interesting to think about how all these political parties will cooperate with each other when they all hate foreigners. But they didn't get 10%. They only got 9.7%. So that's, we think, positive in the Greens in Sweden. In Finland, you have the True Finns, which is they don't have any Nazi history. They are more nationalists, countryside nationalism, and they got, I think, 12%, something like that. But they had the result was not as good as the last election to the Finnish parliament. So you could see that also as maybe a positive sign that they actually declined a bit from that. So I think that when we discuss the EU issues in Sweden, these issues, the right-wing Euroscepticism is not very strong, but it is there, of course, it is. But in Sweden, we also have this left-wing Euroscepticism. The left party in Sweden are still opposing membership. And they are opposing it because they think EU is capitalist. So they think it's too much like the market. The market is actually the ones who are in charge of everything, and it's only the money that can run for free, and people are not allowed to move wherever they like, but it's just the money and the companies that are traveling around and such things. And then we used to have also the green Euroscepticism. So we have lots of different types of Euroscepticism in Sweden. And it is a balance, of course. It's very much of a balance to try to balance between the decentralization issue, which is very green and very important, and the nationalism that is the risk that you get caught in when you oppose the EU.
Jean Lambert, English Green Party MEP, raises the issue of borders, a theme taken up in the context of the forthcoming independence referendum by Maggie Chapman of the Scottish Green Party.
Sort of Barroso's comments on it. I think one of the issues that sort of comes up in this is about borders. What are the borders? How does that work? That if Scotland becomes independent, then there is this issue about technically is Scotland still a member of the European Union or not? Probably not. In which case, that then becomes the external border of the European Union. What are the implications of that? What are the implications for free movement? Certainly one of the big questions that exists in London, we have 1 million EU nationals in London, is that if the UK as a whole decides that it wants to leave the European Union, what then are the rights of the 1 million EU nationals living in London, the 2.3 in the UK as a whole, and 2.5 UK nationals living elsewhere in the European Union? You can discuss this for hours. It is possible, I know this. And it's a really interesting discussion, particularly whether you then want to become Switzerland, Norway, or none of the above. That also, of course, if the UK leaves, then we're in this question too about what's the border.
We've had the ability to be visionary beaten out of us, either literally or figuratively, and over the last few years. And I think that's what we need to get back. That's what I think the green movement can do Jean's, I think, absolutely right when she says, the Greens are very well placed to do this. We just need to work out how we can talk to other people in a language that they understand. And in many ways, that's our problem as political parties. But it's also our problem in terms of community engagement. Me going and knocking on the door of a council estate in the East End of Glasgow. It's if I can talk about some of the things we've been talking about today, and think, you know what, I'm going to the food bank queue just now. How's that going to help? What are you going to do about that? So I think there's a huge challenge for us on the progressive left of politics across Europe. How do we make Europe matter to people? How do we say that actually a worker in Portugal should be of much a concern of mine as a crofter in Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides? How do we bring those communities of interest? How do we bring those politics together? And we have a way of doing that through the EU. I think we have a battle because the Farages of this world have absolutely no interest in that. The idea that UKIP's anti-establishment, I find, completely bizarre. Millionaires, former bankers, current bankers, bankrolling an organisation that wants to be isolationist. How is that anti-establishment in any way? I don't.
Stephen Agnew, leader of the Green Party in Northern Ireland, is worried that the media and mainstream parties in the UK appear to have conceded the argument that goods should be able to move freely in the EU, but that people shouldn't.
Moved into that realm.
And that's not all that's on his mind.
The movement of people, but it worries me even more, shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but when I heard Bob Crow, then leader of the Unite Union, start to challenge it and start to talk about local jobs for local people. And when we have the left making the arguments of the right, then we really are in trouble. So I think we need to step back a bit. And there is a tension. As somebody who considers himself a socialist and who is worried about class politics, there is a tension there about free movement of people if it brings down labour rights in the UK. One, we have to make sure it doesn't happen by strong workers' rights within the UK and them being applied, so people not working below the minimum wage, which is often the claim, exaggerated I believe, but it does occur. But we do need to look at Europe holistically. As a socialist, you've got to believe in solidarity, not just amongst the working class of England, but amongst the working class of Europe. And the fact that I don't have the facts to back this, I've tried to find them before, but my understanding is in Poland, when so many people left Poland, they had to put up wages in Poland to attract people back. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the consequence. It's not simply they flood the market over here and our wages all drop. And I would blame the corporations for that more than the people who come over. But it's about starting to equalise Europe, and sometimes that means them coming up and us coming down a little, and somewhere we will meet. But as I say, if you have good national domestic laws protecting workers, then you make sure it's not a race to the bottom, unlike we've seen with Texas and corporate law and some cases workers' rights that have been denigrated due to the lobbying of corporations. I think again back to the how do you make these changes, and I'll try to be brief. I think you have to bring people with you one step rather than five, and it's something we're guilty of in the Green Party and the Green Movement. We are forward thinking and we look long term, but we got to meet people where they're at. So if somebody says to me, I don't believe in climate change, I say, do you believe in asthma? Of course. Not an idiot. And I say, well, that's good, let's take cars off the road so as your kids don't get asthma. Bring it back to the level of people's day-to-day lives, because we might live and breathe this stuff, but we have to bring it to a level they understand. I mentioned winning elections, and again, one of the things I read here was the Greens were one MEP short of getting a Europe-wide target to and bring renewable energy up to 45% by 2030. Numbers do matter in terms of the European Parliament, and we need to get more Greens in there. And a lot of what I was talking about, I hope, is a roadmap to doing that.
Agnew was talking here about power in a political sense. But what about the quintessential green issue of literal power? Stefan Andresen of Queen's University and Ross Brown, newly elected to Belfast City Council for the Greens, debated the issue of fracking versus renewable energy.
But, my good friend and colleague John had sort of invited me in today to be, if you will, the sunny side of fracking, or perhaps to present the sunny side of fracking, or perhaps to paraphrase a great slogan from the big ideological debates of the last century, fracking with a human face. So that's, with that we'll get going. Okay, so what I wanted to try to get across is essentially two questions that I was interested in thinking about today. And the first one is, why, first of all, does this debate about shale gas in particular, but also shale oil matter? Why are so many people interested in the potential for fracking? Right, so what all this is based on essentially is, or are two maybe not so optimistic or not so happy assumptions, and clearly there's some debate about these assumptions, and we can maybe get back to that later on. But the first one is that we're demonstrably not moving towards, right, at the global level, a post-carbon or a post-fossil fuel global economy within the foreseeable future. Right? That's pretty clear, and I'll have a few data here in a minute, irrespective of what sort of projections and what sort of data we look at. Right? Energy demand based on fossil fuels is in fact steadily increasing, and it likely will continue to increase, right? With some important regional variations, the EU, of course, being one of those. Okay? That's the first assumption. Second one, perhaps slightly more controversial, is that intermittent sources of renewable energy, right, will not supply all of our energy demand. And in particular, this is because, the argument goes, they're not scalable. They're simply not scalable today or in the foreseeable future to supply that enormous rise in demand in emerging markets in particular. Right? And if this is true, then it means that the debates about renewables become less significant from the global point of view. Right? At least in terms of energy demand, right? Impacts on the environment and so on are, of course, a different story, and we'll get to that. So, if then we buy these two assumptions, which you may or may not do, if we have this reality, then it is, of course, a fact that using more gas from shale, for example, rather than coal and oil in particular, will at least mitigate global emissions and the overall climate impact. Right? Now, okay, mitigating is not resolving very serious problems that we're facing, right? So whether or not this is at all acceptable is, of course, a matter, it's ultimately a political question, which is something that's up to democratic bodies of people to discuss and make decisions on, right? But that's sort of the assumptions that I'm using going into this. And just to illustrate this then, right, again, we have different projections using slightly different methodologies that give us slightly different curves, right? But the EIA figures are, I think, as good as any, and the story is pretty clear, right? We are going to use a lot more energy of all kinds of types over the next few decades.
Ross, I'm going to call on you straight away, okay?
Okay, thanks for having me speak today. I'm going to respond to some of what Stefan has said, but also outline a number of key points as well. And really to go give you an outline of what I'm going to say is really to make the case that fracking is backing. Fracking is the wrong horse, and it's a lock-in fuel that's going to keep us locked into a fossil fuel-based economy, and it's not the solution to our energy needs. I'm going to also make the case about the economics of fracking and describe how I see it as a subprime energy and why that is the case, and what is the alternative. And they also look at the artificial nature of low prices that actually have developed in America. The economics of fracking are hard. That's coming from a US financial journalist, Wolf Richter, writing in the Business Insider. Why is that? Why are we saying that the economics are hard? Well, in June 2011, it started to come to light when the New York Times released an investigation that first unearthed some major cracks in the shale boom, or so-called shale boom narrative, where many companies actually in America had been intentionally or illegally overstating productivity of their wells and the size of the reserves. We have had since this date the US Marcellus Shale reserves, the biggest area in the United States, downgraded by 80%, the amount of reserves that were there. Polish shale reserves downgraded by 85% in February 2012. The shale reserves in India downgraded by 90% in May 2012. And also they incorporated renewable energy and energy efficiency standards. And it is possible to have that energy transformation. Work by researchers in Stanford University and the University of California have demonstrated that we can move to 100% renewable energy by 2030. There is no technological impediments to doing so, only political barriers. And in terms of cost of all this, well, again, McKinsey and Company, ECF, the Energy Futures Lab, and Oxford Economics and Imperial College London did a major study looking at the costs of going 100% renewable by 2050, and they found that the costs of energy would be no higher than it would be under a high carbon business as usual regime by that date. So I want to just finish off, as I said previously, the political decisions will determine demand for energy, demand for fossil fuels going forward. It is not a given that those trajectories need go up. It is about politics. And as I say, there is no technological impediments. In terms of costs, when you look at onshore wind, the projections are that they will reach break-even cost price by 2016, and already the impact of renewable energy is starting to have an impact, a downward pressure on the marginal cost of wholesale electricity prices. Renewables are mature technology, but we also crucially have to also look at how we can reduce our energy demand. So, as I say, hopefully that gives you some idea. I can talk much more, as you say, many more notes. I can talk all weekend about this, and
finally, to bring us full circle, John Barry, also recently elected as a Green Party councillor, but a professor of green political economy at Queen's University Belfast into the bargain, discussed the lessons of the Northern Irish peace process in terms of making a transition to a sustainable society.
I'd rather see people jaw. Jaw does not mean you all sit down and be nice to each other and agree. You can shout and scream so long as you do not transgress this one issue. The one thing you don't want to do is get and transgress past the thresholds of violence. So the new threshold is not us and them. It becomes the threshold of violence and non-violence. That sense of fluidity, that's a political strategic decision, but it also reflects, I think, the underlying, green perspective on Northern Ireland as a place where these islands overlap, to allow a more multiplicity of identities and hybridity than perhaps is given by this us-them dynamic. So in other words, when I'm talking about conflict management, it's not that, it's demons over there. We've got a lot of that, we call it whataboutery. What about demons? It's they're causing the problem. The division within unsustainability is as much a psychological division in the self as it is a division between capitalists or pro-fracking and those supporting renewable energy. We're all conflicted on this issue. And I think we need to, many of us recognise, we don't often publicly talk about it, that we're all conflicted on this issue. So conflict management is partly it's internal as much as it is an external expression. And to me, just to finish up, it's the reasons why I think a green perception of the transition from unsustainability has to be an exercise in conflict management in a democratic process. I am of the view, and have been for many years, is that democracy is non-violent disagreement. Now, I think that's much healthier than actual conflict. Again, it's this transition from enemy to opponent, from antagonism to what I call, my pointy academic hat, agonism. So this idea of this conflict transformation is about how do we make things less bad.
Make things less bad. In a sense, those 4 words of one syllable could be seen as summing up half of the message of green political economy. But there's another part of the picture, a positive, inclusive vision of a sustainable and equitable society in which my flourishing need not mean your destruction, in which we work out together how to share this one finite world.
To find out more about these issues and for more recordings, visit the website of the Green Foundation Ireland. That's greenfoundationireland.ie.